At 03:26 hours local time, 16 Ukrainian FP-2 strike drones left dispersed launch positions across the Odessa region and turned southeast, dropping to 60 meters above the Black Sea surface almost immediately. Their target was Saki military airfield on the western edge of Crimea, 190 kilometers away, home to the 43rd Naval Attack Aviation Regiment, and the base Russia had been using to stage two 22M backfire bombers for long-range strike missions over Ukrainian cities. The bombers were not at Saki when the 16 drones launched. They were still airborne, returning from a mission that had begun several hours earlier. Ukraine's strike planners knew exactly where the aircraft were in their flight cycle, and they had built the launch timing around that knowledge with a precision that had taken 22 days of intelligence collection to make reliable. The FP-2 formation needed roughly 90 minutes to cover the 190 kilometers to Saki at cruise speed. The bombers needed roughly the same time to complete their return leg, enter the landing pattern, touch down, taxi to the main parking apron, and begin the post-mission refueling and rearming sequence that would leave multiple aircraft simultaneously on the ground, stationary, fueled, and exposed. The 16 drones were not racing the bombers back to Saki. They were timed to arrive shortly after them, specifically during the 40 to 90-minute window after the last aircraft landed when refueling was underway, and the fleet was concentrated on the parking apron in exactly the configuration 3 weeks of overhead observation had been waiting to confirm. Each FP-2 in the formation cost approximately $80,000. 16 of them totaled just under $1.5 million in procurement. Each 222M backfire parked on the Saki apron that morning cost between $50 and $75 million, was crewed by 4 people, and typically carried Kh-22 cruise missiles on its hardpoints at approximately $1 million per missile. Ukraine was launching a $1.5 million strike against a target package worth north of $400 million at conservative valuation. Destroying a single bomber would represent a return on that investment no conventional weapon system on the planet could approach at the same cost. The 22M backfire has been in service since the 1970s and carries a combat radius of roughly 2,400 kilometers, enough to reach almost any point in Ukraine from deep inside Russian territory without ever entering range of Ukrainian air defenses. It flies at altitudes and speeds where modern long-range systems are optimized to engage it. It carries the Kh-22 missile, a weapon that travels at Mach 4.6 and is specifically designed to overwhelm the kind of layered point defense Ukraine had been building throughout this war. From the perspective of Russian air campaign planners, the 222M was their most effective platform for strikes on hardened or deeply defended targets, and it was nearly impossible for Ukraine to stop while in flight. The vulnerability was always on the ground. An aircraft that cannot be intercepted airborne has to land somewhere, and wherever it lands, it sits stationary, fueled, and surrounded by the same maintenance and logistics infrastructure that keeps it operational. Infrastructure that is considerably harder to harden than the aircraft itself. Russia had moved a significant portion of its 222M fleet to Saki specifically because the base sat behind Crimea's multi-layered air defense network. The S-400 Triumph battery at Olyanka provided long-range coverage over the western approaches. S-350 Vityaz systems covered the medium-altitude band inland. Pantsir S-1 batteries ringed the airfield perimeter itself. On any reasonable assessment of the threat environment at the time the decision was made, Saki was one of the most defensible air bases available. Flying bombers from the Russian mainland meant longer transit times, higher fuel consumption, and reduced sortie tempo. Flying from Saki solved all 3 problems simultaneously. The decision to move the fleet there was not reckless. It was a rational optimization of a real operational problem made against a threat picture that, until the strike campaign targeting Crimean infrastructure began in earnest, had not included low-altitude drone swarms capable of reaching the inner airfield from the sea. The problem was that optimizations made against a previous threat environment tend to create vulnerabilities in the new one. Every 222M move to Saki for operational efficiency was a 222M move to a location Ukraine was already cataloguing. There is a specific dynamic at work here that keeps appearing across this campaign in different forms. A defense network built around a well-understood, historically consistent threat develops its coverage, its alert posture, and its crew training around that threat. It does this efficiently and rationally. The S-400 at Olyanka had been positioned, oriented, and calibrated around the kind of threat that was most likely to approach from the northwest at medium to high altitude, because that had been the dominant attack profile for most of the conflict. When a formation split into a high group designed to look exactly like that profile and a low group designed to exploit the coverage gap that focusing on that profile created, the network wasn't failing to do its job. It was doing its job against the threat it had been built to expect, while the threat it wasn't built for arrived from a direction and altitude it had never been asked to prioritize. The intelligence groundwork for this strike began 22 days before the drones launched. Not tracking the bombers themselves, their flight paths over Ukraine were documented by a separate thread of collection entirely. What the 22 days were spent on was the ground schedule at Saki. How long after landing before refueling began? How many aircraft were typically parked simultaneously during the post-mission servicing window? Whether the ground crews followed a consistent sequence or varied it by mission profile, where on the parking apron each aircraft typically sat relative to the others. Whether the hardened individual shelters on the north side of the base were used for overnight storage or left as daytime staging areas while missions were active. And most critically, whether the window when the majority of the fleet was simultaneously exposed, fueled, and stationary was reliable enough to plan a precision-timed strike around. The overhead observation also produced something that would shape the strike's targeting priorities directly. A detailed picture of which part of the apron was consistently the most concentrated, which refueling trucks moved predictably to which aircraft positions, and where the maintenance hangar on the northern edge of the apron sat in relation to the main parking line. Understanding the geometry of the apron mattered as much as understanding the timing of the window. A strike that arrived at the right time but hit the wrong part of the base was a strike that failed to exploit the concentration the timing had been designed to catch. The answer was yes. The window ran consistently from roughly 40 minutes after the last bomber landed to around 90 minutes after that. During this period, refueling trucks were connected, rearming was in early stages, and aircraft occupied their assigned apron positions before the ground sequence moved them toward individual hardened shelters. 50 minutes was not generous margin, but 50 minutes was more than enough for a formation launch to arrive at precisely this moment, provided the launch timing was calibrated correctly, which required knowing with confidence when the last bomber in the returning formation was expected to touch down. That timing came from a separate intelligence thread that Ukraine had been running against this airbase for considerably longer. The pattern was consistent enough that the 22-day confirmation window was ultimately about reducing the margin of uncertainty, not establishing the pattern from scratch. By the time the strike was authorized, the planners were not guessing at the refueling window. They were working from a schedule reliable enough to launch 16 drones a sea crossing away and expect them to arrive inside the right 50 minutes. There was a secondary factor the observation had confirmed. Saki's air defense alert posture ran at reduced intensity during the post-mission ground servicing window compared to periods of active inbound threat. This was not negligence, it was a pattern that develops naturally in any sustained operational environment. Air defense. Crews that have spent the night watching a bomber mission execute and return without incident, who are now monitoring routine ground operations rather than an active threat track, operate at a different level of sustained alertness than crews responding to a fresh alert. That difference is measured in seconds of reaction time. Against a formation timed and designed around exactly this window, seconds were the entire margin. At 0408 hours, the 16 FP2s had covered 130 kilometers and were beginning their split. 8 drones climbed to 1,200 feet, pushed their engines toward maximum output, and accelerated on a direct northwest to southeast bearing directly towards Saki. Fast, loud on radar, and radiating electronic signatures designed to produce the clearest possible contact return on the S-400 Triumph battery at Olyanka. The remaining 8 dropped to 250 feet and curved south, beginning a wide arc that would bring them onto the airfield from the seaside, rather than the inland approach corridor the S-400 was oriented toward. The S-400 crew had been at heightened readiness for 9 minutes, following a regional air defense alert that an unknown formation was tracking southeast from the Odessa coast. The alert was accurate. The picture it provided was incomplete. Radar tracking had been built from the high group only, 8 inbound contacts at 1,200 feet, direct approach bearing, closure speed consistent with a coordinated strike. The 91N6E surveillance radars return on the low group, running at 250 feet over the sea surface 4 kilometers south of the high group's track, was intermittent at best. A series of weak flickers that appeared, faded and reappeared in the baseline clutter without ever building into a track the fire control system was prepared to commit to as a real contact. 39M96E2 interceptor missiles left the S-400 tubes at 0413 hours. The engagement was clean by the numbers. 2 direct hits, 1 near miss that damaged a third FP2's control surfaces and sent it descending toward the sea. On the battery's fire control screen, 3 contacts had been eliminated from the 8 the system was tracking, leaving 5 still inbound. The crew began preparing a second salvo. The 8 drones of the low group were now 11 kilometers from the parking apron and accelerating. The S-400's radar showed a surface clutter picture to the south that was slightly noisier than baseline. Nothing the system was prepared to classify as an inbound threat, because nothing in that picture looked like a valid weapons track. The system had destroyed what it could see. It had spent its first firing sequence on the group Ukraine had designed to be seen. The S-350 Vityaz battery covering the southwestern approach to Saki had been tracking the high group independently on its 50N6A multifunction radar since 0410, building parallel tracks and preparing firing solutions as the 5 surviving high group contacts continued toward the runway threshold. At 0416 hours it fired 4 9M96 interceptors, engaging 3 contacts simultaneously while the 4th missile held in reserve against an engagement failure. 2 more FP2s were destroyed. A third took proximity damage and fell out of the formation before the airfield boundary. The S-35 Oboje's fire control had been accurate, its crew well drilled, its intercepts executed within the system's designed parameters. 2 high group contacts remained, closing on the runway threshold from the northwest, with Pantsir S-1 coverage as their next obstacle. At 0417 hours, the low group surfaced on the S-350 radar, not 8 contacts. 3 intermittent signals at very low altitude emerging from the coastal approach corridor to the southwest and building only partial tracks before fading again behind terrain features and ground clutter. The S-350 crew had 30 seconds to characterize what they were seeing and decide how to respond. Here is the specific problem that 30 seconds presented to the S-350 crew, stated as precisely as the system's parameters allow. The 50N6A radar can track multiple targets and guide missiles to multiple intercept points simultaneously. That capability is real and is one of the reasons the S-350 is considered a serious upgrade over older medium-range systems. But simultaneous tracking against multiple axes is not the same as simultaneous tracking against 2 separate azimuth sectors separated by roughly 90 degrees, with one sector containing confirmed contacts and the other containing partial intermittent signals that the system had not yet classified as weapons. The fire control computer can handle the arithmetic. The human crew still has to decide in real time which picture to trust and which axis to commit missiles toward. And a crew that has just successfully engaged and destroyed 5 contacts from the northwest in a well-drilled sequence that went exactly as trained does not naturally pivot in 30 seconds to treat 3 uncertain southwest signals as the higher priority, even if the geometry examined coldly afterward would suggest it should have. The geometry of the problem had no clean answer. 2 confirmed inbound contacts from the northwest were 90 seconds from the runway threshold. 3 intermittent contacts from the southwest were closer to the parking apron than to any of the positions the S-350 had been placed to cover, approaching from an angle the system hadn't been oriented toward during the high group engagement. Firing northwest addressed the confirmed contacts and left the southwest unengaged. Swinging to track the southwest signals meant the 2 high-group drones would reach the airfield without a final intercept attempt from the S-350. The battery engaged southwest, One missile found a signal. Two others detonated in ground clutter short of the airfield boundary. The two high-group contacts crossed the runway threshold unengaged at 0419 hours. Two Pantsir S-1 systems held the final defensive layer at Saki. The northern battery sat near the main access road. The southwestern battery occupied a hard stand at the corner of the parking apron, positioned to cover the sea approach corridor that any drone coming off the Black Sea would most likely use. Both systems had been tracking the engagement overhead for 11 minutes. Both crews were at full combat readiness, their own shorter-range radars feeding independent pictures, their fire control solutions being continuously updated as the contacts above them changed position and number. At 0419 hours, two high-group FP2s crossed the runway threshold at 1,000 feet and entered their attack runs. The southwestern Pantsir S-1 acquired both contacts, locked the nearer and fired 157 E6 interceptor. Clean hit, one contact down. The second high-group drone dove immediately, dropping from 1,000 feet to 200 in under 10 seconds, stripping the clean geometry from the fire control solution the southwestern battery had been building for the second engagement and forcing a full-track update on a target now descending at 60 degrees with a new closure vector. The update required 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, the diving FP2 covered 220 meters toward the parking apron. The northern Pantsir S-1 had been tasked with the southwest approach from the moment the intermittent low-group signals appeared at 0417. When the high-group contact dove toward the apron from the northwest, the northern battery was already committed to a track vector pointing the wrong direction. Swinging a Pantsir S-1 turret through 90 degrees while simultaneously reacquiring a new contact at low altitude in a time window measured in seconds is not outside the system's physical capability. It is, however, outside the practical capability of a crew that has been managing simultaneous threat tracks from multiple directions for 11 minutes and is making those decisions in real time without the benefit of knowing which contact matters most. Two low-group FP2s reached the parking apron from the southwest at 0421 hours. Coming in at 180 feet across the sea, approach the southwestern Pantsir had been built to cover, while the southwestern Pantsir was committed to tracking a diving contact from the northwest. The battery fired. The missile passed close enough to the lead low-group drone to be logged as a near miss in the after-action reporting. Near was not close enough. At 0422 hours, 3 FP2 drones were in the final seconds of their run simultaneously. The surviving high-group drone completing its dive, 2 low-group aircraft coming in from the southwest. 4 Tu-22M backfire bombers sat on the apron below them, fueled, parked, stationary. The first FP2 struck the fuselage of the nearest Tu-22M just forward of the wing route, detonating its warhead inside the aircraft's primary fuel section. At post-mission partial fill, the aircraft was carrying approximately 30,000 litres of aviation fuel with active refueling trucks still connected at the nose and wing points. The blast ignited the fuel load and the refueling lines simultaneously. The fireball that rose from the first impact was visible from the Crimean coastline. It was also, within seconds, spreading. The refueling truck connected to the first aircraft caught immediately. Its own tank added to a burning fuel pool already moving across the parking apron surface toward the second Tu-22M, parked 14 meters east. 3 ground crew members working on the second aircraft's landing gear had already run clear. The aircraft could not run. Its nose gear assembly had been removed for a scheduled inspection, and the aircraft sat on maintenance jacks, immovable as the burning fuel pool reached its underside. There is a specific quality to the fire that results from aviation fuel burning in open air on a concrete surface that matters for understanding what happened next. It doesn't burn in a single defined flame. It spreads in a sheet, following the surface grade of the concrete, filling every low point and joint in the apron, and igniting everything it contacts. Rubber, hydraulic fluid, ground power cabling, tire assemblies, and the accumulated fuel pooling beneath a parked aircraft that has been refueled many times in the same spot. The second Tu-22M was not struck directly. It was consumed by the same fire that the first impact had started, fed by the burning truck and the spreading pool, while its own landing gear assemblies and tire bays provided additional fuel once the heat reached them. The second FP2, approaching from the southwest, struck the third Tu-22M amidships on its centerline pylon. the hardpoint carrying a KH-22 cruise missile that had been uploaded for the next mission. A KH-22's propellant section is not inert. The detonation that followed was not the FP2's warhead alone. It was the warhead combined with the KH-22's propellant catching fire under explosive compression and then fragmenting outward as the airframe around it failed. The secondary explosion threw debris across a 60-meter radius, impacting the fourth Tu-22M at the end of the parking line across its fuselage and both engine nacelles. The fourth aircraft did not ignite immediately. The fragment damage it sustained punctured fuel line routing in the left engine bay and lodged material in the right engine intake that would be discovered during post-incident inspection to have deformed the first stage compressor blades. It would not fly again for considerably longer than the aircraft that burned. The third FP2 completed its dive into the maintenance hangar on the northern edge of the apron, where a fifth Tu-22M sat on inspection jacks surrounded by hydraulic service equipment, stored spare components, and the kind of combustible workshop material that accumulates in any active maintenance environment. The hangar's metal roof structure offered no meaningful resistance to a 300-kilogram warhead traveling at 150 miles per hour. The aircraft inside it, and every piece of tooling and stored material around it, was engulfed within 90 seconds. By 04:26 hours, Saki's parking apron was burning across 230 meters of frontage. 3 Tu-22Ms directly struck, a fourth carrying terminal fragment damage. A fifth destroyed inside its hangar. The refueling infrastructure, trucks, pump stations, fuel manifolds, ground power units, destroyed or on fire across the entire serviced section of the apron. The secondary explosion from the KH-22 had damaged apron drainage infrastructure, which meant the burning fuel pool had nowhere to drain and continued spreading. The parking apron that Russia had been using to surge its most capable long-range strike aircraft closer to Ukrainian targets had in 4 minutes become a fire that ground crews could not approach and that Saki's internal firefighting capability could not contain without external support. Russia could report with accuracy that its air defense network had performed substantively. 11 of 16 inbound contacts destroyed or diverted before reaching the parking apron. Clean S-400 intercepts on the high group's lead elements. S-350 engaging the low group before it fully closed. Pantsir S-1 accounting for additional contacts through the final approach. Every system responded. Every crew acted. The formation that reached the apron was less than a fifth of the one that left Odessa. The fraction was enough. 5 Tu-22 Air, SASSM. Backfire bombers removed from service in 4 minutes. At $50 million per aircraft as a conservative floor, that is $250 million of Russian long-range strike capacity destroyed. Add the KH-22 missile lost in the third strike, add the refueling infrastructure and maintenance hangar contents, add the weeks of airfield operational disruption while the parking apron is cleared and rebuilt, and the actual cost Russia absorbed that morning is considerably higher than the aircraft count alone reflects. Against a strike expenditure of approximately $1.5 million, the arithmetic does not require commentary. The operational consequence reaches further than the hardware destroyed. The Tu-22M's value to the Russian air campaign was not abstract. It was specifically the aircraft's ability to carry KH-22 missiles to release points closer to western and central Ukraine than any platform flying from the mainland could match. Moving the fleet to Saki had cut each mission profile's transit time significantly, increased the number of sorties each airframe could fly per week, and reduced the fuel load required per mission, which in turn increased the payload available for weapons. Every one of those advantages evaporated the morning Saki's parking apron caught fire. The bombers that survived undamaged had nowhere defensible to operate from that offered the same forward positioning. Moving them back to mainland bases restored the transit time penalty the Saki deployment had been designed to eliminate. Russia could rebuild and redistribute. It could not immediately find another base with Saki's combination of location, runway capacity, and surrounding air defense that hadn't just proven it had a gap wide enough to fly 8 drones through. There is also a second-order effect worth examining because it tends to get lost in the accounting of aircraft destroyed. The KH-22 missile on the third aircraft's centerline pylon was already uploaded for the next mission, the mission that crew would have flown in the coming hours if the FP2 hadn't found it first. One Kh-22 is roughly $1 million of precision munitions. The aircraft carrying it cost $50 million to build. The people whose apartment block or power station or heating plant it was designated to hit that night would not be able to put a number on what stopping it was worth. But Ukraine can run that number in a different direction. The entire 16-drone formation that achieved this outcome cost less than 2 of those missiles. The decision that created this vulnerability was not a mistake in the conventional sense. Moving the Tu-22M fleet to Saki solved a real operational problem. The mistake, if the word applies to something structured this way, was in treating the air defense network around Saki as a fixed parameter rather than a boundary that was actively being tested and probed. Every previous Ukrainian strike against Crimean targets had been a data point. Some succeeded, some were intercepted. All of them, including the ones that failed, told the planners something about where the network's reliable detection began, where it degraded, and which approach vectors carried the most exploitable uncertainty. 22 days of watching the ground schedule at Saki was the visible part of the collection effort. The less visible part was months of accumulated observation across the entire Crimean defense network, each engagement adding one more data point to a picture of exactly where 16 drones needed to fly to arrive at the right place at the right time. Ukraine did not defeat the Saki air defense network. It found the seam between what the network could reliably track and what it couldn't, sized a formation to guarantee that something would survive whatever the network intercepted, and launched it at the one window of the day when the highest value targets on the base were simultaneously exposed and the crews defending them were running at post-mission tempo rather than fresh alert tempo. Patience made the geometry possible. The geometry made the outcome nearly inevitable. And 22 days of watching one airfield's refueling schedule turned out to be exactly the preparation that $400 million worth of Russian aviation could not survive. Thank you for watching until the end of this video. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. After watching how Ukraine timed this strike around the bomber landing and refueling schedule, rather than trying to intercept aircraft in flight, do you think Russia will stop forward deploying Tu-22Ms to Crimea entirely, invest in hardened individual shelters at Saki to break up the apron concentration, or keep flying from exposed parking positions? Let us know what you think, and thank you for supporting this channel.